I gave my daughter a custom-built beach house for her 5th anniversary. When I drove over to drop off a housewarming gift, I froze. A stranger in a tailored suit was outside taking photos of the foundation. Inside, my son-in-law stood behind a thin curtain, staring straight at me instead of coming out to greet me. That is when I knew something was fundamentally wrong. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your sacrifices weaponized against you by the people you loved the most. The coastal highway was slick with morning mist as I maneuvered my truck around the final bend. For 2 years, this drive had been my daily pilgrimage. I am 69 years old, a retired structural engineer, and this property was supposed to be my masterpiece, a legacy carved out of cedar and stone for my daughter Natalie and her husband Trevor. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, a familiar scent that usually brought me peace. Today, however, a strange knot tightened in my chest as the house came into view. I had poured $550,000 of my own retirement savings into this build. I drove every nail, measured every joist, and poured the foundation with my own calloused hands. It was not just a house, it was an inheritance, a fortress designed to protect my child long after I was gone. As I pulled into the crushed gravel driveway, the knot in my chest twisted into a sharp, cold spike of adrenaline. A sleek silver sedan, completely out of place on this rugged stretch of coastline, was parked near the retaining wall. A man I had never seen before was walking the perimeter of the property. He wore a sharp charcoal suit that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of the wild ocean, and he was holding a high-end digital camera. He was not admiring the architecture. He was documenting it with a cold, clinical precision. I watched him snap a photo of the reinforced steel pilings I had spent 3 weeks driving into the bedrock. He moved to the side of the house, photographing the custom wraparound deck and the imported storm windows. My hands gripped the steering wheel. You do not spend 4 decades in commercial construction without learning how to spot a property appraiser. I stepped out of my truck, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my heavy work boots. The sound carried in the quiet morning air, but the man did not look up. He was busy typing something into a digital tablet. I walked toward him, my posture rigid, feeling a sudden protective surge over the timber and stone I had assembled. I cleared my throat loud enough to startle him. He turned, blinking behind wire-rimmed glasses, and offered a polite, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. I asked him directly what he was doing on private property. He did not seem intimidated. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a crisp, white business card, extending it toward me with absolute confidence. I took the card. The embossed letters identified him as a senior commercial appraiser for a high-interest private lending firm based out of the city. I stared at the name, my mind struggling to process the implications. I told him there must be a mistake, that this was a private, debt-free family residence entirely paid for in cash. The appraiser offered a sympathetic but patronizing look. He tapped his tablet screen and stated clearly that there was no mistake. He informed me that the property was currently being evaluated as collateral for a $2 million commercial loan application. He added that the paperwork had been expedited and he was just finalizing the exterior equity assessment before the wire transfer was approved. The words hit me like a physical blow. A commercial loan. Collateral. $2 million. I felt the ground tilt beneath my feet, but I forced my expression to remain entirely blank. I handed his card back, turned away, and walked slowly toward the front door of the house, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I approached the front entrance, my eyes tracing the grain of the solid oak door I had sanded and stained just 3 months ago. I had installed a state-of-the-art biometric deadbolt, a high-security measure, to ensure Natalie always felt safe when Trevor was traveling for work. My thumbprint was programmed as the master key, a symbol that I would always have access to the home I had built for my blood. I raised my hand and pressed my thumb against the glass scanner. The machine whirred softly. Instead of the familiar green light and the heavy click of the unlocking mechanism, a harsh red light flashed across the keypad. The screen blinked with a cold, digital message indicating that access was denied. I stood completely still on the porch. I pressed my thumb down again, applying more pressure, thinking it was a malfunction. The red light flashed again. My print had not just failed, it had been deliberately wiped from the system's registry. The realization washed over me cold and absolute. I had been locked out. I stepped back from the door, my eyes scanning the front of the house. The large floor-to-ceiling windows I had installed to maximize the ocean view reflected the gray morning sky. But as I looked closer, I noticed a slight movement behind the thin, sheer curtains of the living room. I stepped off the porch and walked onto the grass, positioning myself to get a better angle. There, standing half-hidden in the shadows of the living room, was Trevor. He was wearing a fitted cashmere sweater, holding a cup of coffee and staring directly out the window at me. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked expectant. We locked eyes through the glass. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of us moved. I waited for him to set down his coffee, walk to the door, and explain the appraiser. I waited for him to apologize for the lock malfunction. I waited for him to act like a man. Instead, Trevor held my gaze for 3 seconds, his expression completely devoid of guilt or respect. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and pulled the heavy blackout drapes entirely shut, severing our eye contact and plunging the living room into darkness. He did not come to the door. He did not call out. He simply hid behind the fabric, a coward standing inside a fortress I had paid for with my sweat and blood. The silence on the lawn was deafening. I looked back at the appraiser, who was now watching me with mild curiosity. I did not yell. I did not pound my fists against the oak door. I turned around, walked back to my truck, and climbed into the driver's seat. The leather felt cold. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands completely steady. The shock had passed, replaced by a terrifying crystalline clarity. I scrolled to my daughter's name and pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. I expected confusion, perhaps a flurry of excuses or a panicked explanation about a misunderstanding. When Natalie's voice came through the speaker, however, there was no panic. There was only a sharp, cold irritation laced with the background noise of a busy espresso machine. She did not say hello. She immediately asked why I was harassing the appraiser they had hired. The sheer audacity of her tone stole the breath from my lungs. I asked her, keeping my voice dangerously low, and even why my fingerprint had been deleted from the door of the house I built. Natalie let out a long, exasperated sigh, the kind of sigh she used to give when she was a teenager being asked to clean her room. She spoke to me as if I were a slow, bothersome child. She explained that it was nothing personal, but Trevor needed the capital for a new luxury car dealership venture. She actually used the phrase, dead equity. She told me that the house I had built was just sitting there completely useless when it could be leveraged to build their empire. She said they needed to show the bank absolute control over the asset, and having my name or access attached to the property complicated the underwriting process. I listened to my own daughter reduce my life's work, my retirement, and my love to a financial hurdle she needed to clear. I reminded her, my voice still quiet, that the house was a gift for their anniversary, not a piggy bank for Trevor's latest pipe dream. I reminded her of the 2 previous businesses Trevor had run into. The ground businesses I had quietly helped bail out to save her from embarrassment. Natalie's voice sharpened into a defensive sneer. She told me I was living in the past and that I didn't understand modern business scaling. Then she delivered the final blow. She instructed me to get off their property immediately, stop embarrassing them in front of the bank's appraiser, and to call her next week when I had calmed down and could be reasonable. She hung up. The line went dead, leaving me listening to the hollow silence of the truck's cabin. I lowered the phone slowly, staring out the windshield at the beautiful, expensive structure dominating the coastline. She had called it their property. She had ordered me off of it. They believed they had outsmarted me. They believed that because I was an old man who loved his daughter, I would simply absorb this humiliation and walk away in defeat. They thought they held all the cards because they had physically changed the locks and initiated a loan. I reached forward and turned the key in the ignition. The truck engine roared to life. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to break down the door. What I felt was a profound, chilling detachment. The daughter I had raised was gone, replaced by a parasite willing to risk my financial security and my dignity to fund a fraudulent lifestyle. I put the truck in gear and slowly drove down the gravel path, passing the appraiser one last time. Let them take their photos. Let them dream of their $2 million wire transfer. As I merged onto the coastal highway, leaving the house behind, a dark, terrible calm settled over me. They had been so eager to leverage the timber and the stone they had forgotten who engineered the foundation. They had forgotten that in my desire to protect the property from future taxes, I had never actually finalized the municipal land lease with the state. The house belonged to them, but the dirt it sat on did not. I drove toward the county records office knowing exactly how to bring their entire world crashing down. I did not drive back to my apartment. I did not pull over to the side of the highway to let the shock wash over me or shed tears for a daughter who was already gone. In structural engineering, when a load-bearing wall begins to fail, you do not sit down and mourn the plaster. You immediately locate the stress point, assess the structural damage, and prepare for demolition. My family had just collapsed, but the foundation of their greed was built on paperwork. I steered my truck away from the coastline and headed straight for the heart of the city toward the County Hall of Records. The drive took 45 minutes, but time felt suspended. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a calm mechanical precision. The ocean breeze faded, replaced by the exhaust fumes and concrete sprawl of the downtown district. I parked in a municipal garage, the tires squealing softly against the painted concrete, and walked out into the midday heat. The County Hall of Records was an imposing, brutalist concrete structure built in the late 70s. It was entirely devoid of warmth or character. It was exactly the kind of place where humanity was reduced to stamps, signatures, and filing cabinets. It was the perfect battlefield for what I was about to do. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the main lobby. The air conditioning was aggressive, chilling the sweat on my forehead. The air smelled faintly of floor wax, stale coffee, and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed continuously overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the rows of plastic waiting chairs and the thick plexiglass windows of the clerk stations. It was a cold, bureaucratic purgatory where people came to register births, finalize divorces, and dispute property lines. Today, I was here to document a theft. I pulled a paper ticket from the red dispenser near the entrance. Number 84. I looked up at the digital display board above the counters. It read 62. I walked over to a row of uncomfortable plastic chairs and sat down. I did not look at my phone. I did not check for missed calls or text messages. I knew Natalie would not reach out. She had delivered her ultimatum and expected me to retreat into the quiet submission of old age. She expected the silence of a defeated man. She was going to get silence, but it would be the silence of a fuse burning down to the powder keg. I watched the clerks behind the glass. They moved with slow, deliberate indifference, stamping documents and handing over clipboards. To them, it was just another Tuesday morning. They were entirely unaware that the pieces of paper they handled held the power to destroy lives, dissolve marriages, and send people to federal prison. I focused on my breathing, keeping my heart rate slow and steady. My mind shifted into a purely analytical state. I began calculating the sequence of legal events that must have occurred for that appraiser to be standing on my property. Trevor could not just ask a bank for a $2 million commercial loan against a property he did not own. The bank would require absolute proof of title. Therefore, the title had to have been altered. The digital board beeped loudly, flashing my number. I stood up and walked to window 4. a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read. Sylvia looked up at me without smiling. She asked how she could help me. I kept my voice polite and level. I gave her the exact parcel identification number and the municipal address of the beach house. I told her I needed to pull the complete public record file for the property, specifically requesting any deed transfers, lien attachments, or equity reassessments filed within the last 6 months. Sylvia typed the parcel number into her keyboard. The mechanical clacking of the keys seemed exceptionally loud in the quiet room. She stared at her monitor for a long moment, her eyes scanning the digital summary. She nodded slightly, told me it would be a $10 printing fee, and asked me to wait while she retrieved the physical file from the archives. I handed her a $10 bill. She disappeared behind a row of tall metal filing cabinets. Standing alone at the counter, I rested my hands on the cool linoleum surface. I closed my eyes for a brief second. I remembered the day I went to the lumberyard to select the main support beams for the house. I had spent hours inspecting each piece of timber, checking for hidden rot or structural weaknesses, wanting everything to be perfect for my daughter. I had protected that house from hurricanes and salt corrosion, but I had failed to protect it from the rot inside my own family. Sylvia returned a few minutes later, holding a thick manila folder. It was surprisingly heavy. She slid it under the plexiglass gap along with a printed receipt. She told me I could review the documents at the reading tables in the back of the room, but I could not leave the building with the original file. I thanked her, picked up the folder, and walked to a secluded wooden table in the far corner of the records room. I sat down and placed the folder squarely in front of me. This was the moment of truth. I took a deep breath, opened the cover, and began to turn the pages. The first few documents were familiar. They were the original building permits I had pulled 2 years ago. I saw my own signature, bold and precise, authorizing the excavation. I saw the municipal approvals for the plumbing and electrical work. These pages were a testament to my labor, a chronological history of the sweat I had poured into the coastal soil. I continued to turn the pages, moving closer to the present date. Suddenly, the nature of the documents changed. The familiar municipal forms were replaced by dense, complicated legal contracts from a private wealth management firm. My eyes scanned the header. It was a commercial equity application. I turned another page and found exactly what I was looking for. It was a quitclaim deed. The document was dated exactly 3 weeks ago. It stated that I, Nolan, being of sound mind, willfully and permanently relinquished all rights, title, and interest in the coastal property, transferring full legal ownership to Trevor and Natalie. The stated consideration for this transfer was $1 single. I stared at the bottom of the page. There, on the designated line for the grantor, was my signature. It looked like my handwriting. The loops and angles were carefully mimicked. But I had never held a pen to this paper. I had never seen this document in my life. It was a forgery executed with chilling precision. Trevor had not just locked me out of the house. He had stolen it right out from under me on paper. I looked to the right of the forged signature. There was a bright blue notary stamp belonging to a man named Arthur Vance. The notary had officially certified that I had appeared before him in person, presented valid identification, and signed the document willingly. Trevor had found a corrupt notary willing to authenticate a ghost. They had fabricated my presence, stolen my equity, and handed it to a bank to fund a luxury car dealership. The physical sensation of holding that piece of paper was indescribable. It was not just a legal document. It was a death certificate for my relationship with my daughter. For Trevor to orchestrate this level of fraud, Natalie had to be completely complicit. She had to have known. She probably watched him practice forging my signature on scrap paper at their kitchen table. She had traded her father for a down payment on a business venture. I ran my thumb over the raised seal of the blue notary stamp. The paper felt rough against my skin. In that quiet, sterile corner of the records room, the last remaining thread of paternal forgiveness snapped. If they had simply asked me for the money, I might have given it to them. If they had been honest about their financial desperation, I would have tried to help. But they did not ask. They chose to treat me like an obstacle to be bypassed, a foolish old man who would not notice his life savings being stolen from beneath his feet. I did not feel angry. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion that makes you careless. What I felt was entirely cold and perfectly clear. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and put them on. I took out a small notepad and a pen. I carefully wrote down the name of the corrupt notary, the date of the fraudulent transfer, and the contact information for the private lending firm listed on the commercial loan application. I documented every single piece of evidence, every lie they had submitted to the county. They believed they had executed a flawless crime. They believed the house was theirs to leverage. But as I stared at the forged deed, a slow, grim realization settled over me. In their rush to steal the equity and secure the private loan, they had only focused on the structure itself. They had forged the transfer of the house, but they had completely ignored the complexity of the ground beneath it. I closed the manila folder. I had seen enough. The betrayal was absolute, but so was their ignorance. They had built a mountain of fraudulent debt on a foundation that I still completely controlled. I stood up, walked back to the clerk's window, and returned the file to Sylvia. I stepped out of the county hall of records and back into the sweltering heat of the city. It was time to go see my attorney. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you try to steal from the architect. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck inside the dimly lit municipal parking garage. The engine remained off. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of motor oil and concrete dust, but I did not roll down the windows. I stared at the passenger seat. Lying there was the certified photocopy of the quitclaim deed I had purchased from the county clerk before leaving the records building. I reached out and picked it up. The paper was still warm from the copy machine. I ran my index finger over the black ink of my forged signature. The forger had done a remarkable job mimicking the sharp, jagged angles of my first name. They had captured the slight downward slant I always used when signing official documents. But it lacked the heavy, deliberate pressure of my hand. It was a hollow imitation, much like the affection my daughter had shown me over the last decade. Looking at the false loops of that signature, the concrete walls of the parking garage seemed to fade. I was suddenly standing in the kitchen of our old house in the suburbs. Natalie was 13 years old. She was sitting at the breakfast table, nervously pushing her cereal around in a bowl. I was holding her midterm report card. I remembered the exact shade of the blue ink she had used to forge my signature on the parent acknowledgement line. She had failed algebra and tried to hide it. When I confronted her, she did not apologize for the failing grade or the deception. Instead, she burst into theatrical tears, screaming that I put too much pressure on her, that I was an impossible father to please. She deflected her guilt and weaponized her tears to make herself the victim. I had comforted her that day. I had hugged her, told her we would get a tutor, and swept the forgery under the rug. I had taught her that tears were an acceptable currency to buy her way out of accountability. I looked back down at the real estate deed in my hand. She had graduated from forging report cards to forging federal loan documents, confident that I would simply absorb the damage just like I did when she was a child. My eyes moved away from the signature and settled on the dark circle of the corrupt notary stamp. The dark ink of the seal reminded me of a very specific color. It was the exact shade of midnight blue paint that used to coat the sides of my first work truck. Another memory snapped into focus with violent clarity. Natalie was 17. It was a Saturday morning. I walked out to the driveway to find the entire passenger side of my work truck caved in the metal, completely crumpled. Natalie was standing on the porch, her arms crossed, claiming she had parked it safely at the grocery store and returned to find it destroyed by a hit-and-run driver. She told the story with absolute conviction, looking me dead in the eyes. I almost believed her. But later that afternoon, I walked around to the back of our house and found the matching blue paint scraped deeply into the brick column of our own garage. She had taken the truck without permission in the middle of the night, crashed it into our own house, and lied to my face without a single tremor in her voice. When I showed her the paint on the bricks, she did not confess. She doubled down, blaming the darkness, blaming the narrow driveway, blaming everything except her own reckless behavior. She had always possessed an astonishing capacity to justify her own destruction. I shifted the photocopy in my hands, scanning down to the consideration line. The document legally stated that I had transferred a $550,000 custom-built coastal property to her and Trevor for the sum of $1. $1. The sheer audacity of that number brought another bitter memory to the surface. It was the day of her wedding, exactly 5 years ago. I had spent $40,000 of my savings to give her the elegant garden reception she demanded. I remembered walking into the bridal suite just before the ceremony. She was wearing a silk gown that cost more than my first car. Instead of thanking me, she was loudly complaining to her bridesmaids that I had been too cheap to upgrade the floral arrangements from local roses to imported orchids. Trevor was standing in the corner, adjusting his tuxedo cuffs, nodding in agreement, and smirking at my discomfort. They had viewed my $40,000 sacrifice as inadequate. They believed they were entitled to more simply because they existed. That entitlement had festered and grown into a monstrous, insatiable thing. That same entitlement was what allowed them to type the words $1 on a fraudulent deed, believing they inherently deserved everything I had built. I folded the photocopy and placed it carefully into my breast pocket, right over my heart. The memories stopped. The parking garage came back into sharp focus. For 30 years, I had been my daughter's safety net. I had absorbed her lies, paid for her mistakes, and foolishly believed that unconditional love would eventually teach her respect. I was wrong. Unconditional love without boundaries had only taught her that I was a resource to be exploited. I reached forward and turned the key in the ignition. The heavy diesel engine rumbled to life, echoing off the concrete walls. I was done being a resource. I was done absorbing the damage. The pattern of deception ended today. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the exit booth, pulling out into the blinding afternoon sun. I was heading to see my attorney. I was going to hand him the match, and we were going to burn their fraudulent empire to the ground. The glass doors of the law firm slid open with a quiet hiss. I stepped off the elevator and onto the thick wool carpet of the reception area. The air conditioning was perfectly calibrated, smelling faintly of lemon polish and expensive leather. It was a sterile, controlled environment that catered to wealthy men who made their living moving numbers on a screen. I was a man who made his living moving steel and concrete, but Warren had been my attorney and my friend for 30 years. He had drafted the original articles of incorporation for my construction company. He had stood beside me at the cemetery when I buried my wife. He knew the exact measure of my life and the depth of my sacrifices. The receptionist recognized me immediately and nodded toward the large corner office at the end of the hall. I did not bother waiting to be announced. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open. Warren was sitting behind a massive oak desk reviewing a thick stack of deposition transcripts. He looked up, taking off his wire-rimmed reading glasses. He smiled warmly, leaning back in his chair, and asked what brought me into the city center on a Tuesday afternoon. I did not smile back. I walked straight across the room, pulled the folded photocopy of the quitclaim deed from my breast pocket, and placed it flat on the center of his immaculate desk. I told him to look very closely at the signature on the bottom line. Warren leaned forward, his professional curiosity piqued by my grim demeanor. He picked up the paper. I watched his eyes scan the standard legal boilerplate, moving down the paragraphs until they landed on the ink at the bottom. The warm, welcoming expression on his face vanished entirely. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He asked when I had decided to transfer the coastal property entirely over to Natalie and Trevor. He sounded genuinely hurt, mentioning that I should have let him handle the transfer paperwork to protect me from massive capital gains taxes. I kept my voice perfectly flat. I told him I had never transferred the property. I told him I had never seen that document before today. I told him the signature was a complete forgery. The silence in the office became heavy and suffocating. Warren looked back down at the document. The friendly advisor disappeared, and the ruthless corporate litigator instantly took over. His posture straightened, and his eyes darted across the page with a new aggressive focus. He examined the blue notary stamp. He checked the consideration amount of $1. He noted the municipal filing date. When he finally spoke, his voice was strictly professional, stripped of all personal warmth. He asked me exactly how I had discovered this theft. I explained my morning. I told him about the commercial appraiser standing on the lawn. I explained the $2 million commercial loan application that was currently being expedited. I described the red flashing light of the biometric scanner and the profound cowardice of Trevor hiding behind the living room curtains. I relayed the phone call with Natalie, repeating her exact words about my life's work being nothing more than dead equity. Warren stood up slowly and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the sprawling city skyline. He clasped his hands tightly behind his back. He told me that this was no longer a simple family dispute over entitlement or a lack of gratitude. He explained that by forging a real estate deed to secure a commercial loan from a private lending institution, Trevor had crossed a massive, inescapable legal threshold. Warren turned around and began to outline the exact nature of the crime. He used the legal terminology like a surgeon uses a scalpel, dissecting their actions with cold, terrifying precision. He stated that submitting a fraudulent property deed to a financial institution constituted bank fraud of the highest order. Because the loan application was processed electronically and likely utilized federal banking systems, it immediately triggered federal wire fraud statutes. He explained that hiring a corrupt notary to authenticate a forged signature elevated the crime to a coordinated conspiracy to commit fraud. Warren walked back to his desk and slammed his open hand down hard on the photocopy. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that if we took this single piece of paper to the district attorney, Trevor would be facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Then Warren lowered his voice, delivering the hardest truth of all. He told me that Natalie, as a direct beneficiary of the fraudulent transfer, and the legal spouse securing the commercial loan, would be indicted as an active co-conspirator. She would be stripped of everything, arrested, and sent to a federal prison right alongside her husband. Warren reached across his desk for his telephone. He told me he was going to call a contact he maintained at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He said we needed to freeze the loan application immediately before the bank transferred the $2 million. If the wire transfer cleared, the criminal charges would multiply exponentially, and the property would be tied up in federal asset forfeiture for a decade. He lifted the heavy black receiver. I reached out and pressed my hand firmly down on the receiver, disconnecting the line. Warren stopped. He stared at my hand, then slowly looked up at my face. He was completely bewildered. He reminded me that they had stolen a $550,000 asset from me. He reminded me that they had locked me out of the very house I built with my own 2 hands to protect my daughter. He asked me, his voice rising in disbelief, why I was stopping him from protecting my estate and punishing the people who had robbed me blind. I pulled my hand back and sat down heavily in the leather chair opposite his desk. I looked at the man who had known me for 3 decades. I told him that calling the federal authorities would turn my family into a public spectacle. It would require months of depositions, aggressive criminal trials, and humiliating local news articles. It would mean sitting in a cold courtroom and watching aggressive prosecutors tear my daughter apart on the witness stand. I told him that despite the absolute betrayal, despite the theft and the cruelty, I would not be the man who put steel handcuffs on my own child. But I also made it absolutely clear, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, that I was not going to walk away and let them win. I was going to strip them of everything they thought they had stolen. I was going to dismantle their entire fraudulent empire, and I was going to do it completely legally without ever dialing emergency services or involving a single police officer. Warren sat back down slowly. He knew me well enough to recognize the dark, unyielding resolve in my voice. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and asked me what exactly I was planning to do. I asked him to think back to the day we finalized the purchase of the coastal land 2 years ago. I reminded him that the plot was remarkably cheap for beachfront property, because it directly bordered a highly protected state wildlife conservancy. I asked him to recall the specific rigid zoning restrictions attached to that specific parcel of dirt. Warren closed his eyes for a moment, accessing his vast encyclopedic memory of my business dealings. When he opened them, a sudden glimmer of realization sparked in his eyes. He began to recite the statute from memory. The land was bound by a strict, non-transferable agricultural and environmental provision. It allowed for the construction of a single-family dwelling, provided the original owner maintained the ecological integrity of the surrounding acreage. But the most critical clause, the one we had spent weeks negotiating with the state commission, was that the land could never be commercialized. Leveraged for corporate debt, or transferred to another party without a comprehensive environmental audit and express written permission from the state government. I nodded slowly. I pointed at the forged quitclaim deed lying on his desk. I explained that by forging that transfer and brazenly offering the property as collateral for a commercial car dealership loan, Trevor had not just defrauded a bank. He had fundamentally violated the ironclad state charter. He had broken the legal covenant with the Environmental Conservancy. Warren leaned forward, his brilliant legal mind racing ahead, connecting the dots of my strategy. He whispered that the penalty for violating that specific state charter was severe and immediate. The state government had the absolute authority to revoke the land lease entirely. They could seize the parcel back into the public trust and legally demand that the property be restored to its natural, undeveloped condition. I looked at him with absolute certainty. I told him that was exactly what we were going to do. We were not going to report a forgery to the police. We were going to report a gross zoning and commercialization violation to the State Environmental Commission. I instructed Warren to draft a formal legal notification to the state outlining Trevor's attempt to commercialize the protected land. I told him to make absolutely sure the private lending firm received a copy of that notification before the loan was finalized. The bank would instantly withdraw their funding the moment they realized the collateral was built on restricted, non-transferable state land. Trevor would lose his $2 million financial lifeline instantly, but I was not finished. I leaned closer to Warren. I told him to draft a second document. Since I was the original leaseholder on record, and the deed transfer was fundamentally invalid due to the charter violation, the state would require the immediate demolition of the unauthorized structure. I wanted Warren to formally petition the state board to award me the municipal demolition contract. Warren stared at me, completely stunned by the sheer calculated ruthlessness of the strategy. He realized I was not just going to take the house back. I was going to use the massive bureaucratic power of the state government to legally mandate its total destruction. I was going to erase the house from the face of the earth, leaving Trevor and Natalie with nothing but the crushing debt of their failing businesses and absolutely no asset to borrow against. I would tear down my own masterpiece, destroying my own $550,000 investment just to ensure they had nowhere to hide. He asked me if I was absolutely sure about this path. He reminded me of the months of labor I had spent driving those steel pilings. He warned me that once he filed these state documents, there was no turning back. The house would be destroyed by law. The financial ruin for Trevor and Natalie would be absolute, inescapable, and permanent. They would be bankrupted by the commercial loan default and left with nothing. I stood up from the leather chair. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below, feeling no hesitation whatsoever. I thought about the red light on the scanner. I thought about my daughter defending a thief. I turned back to Warren. I told him to file the paperwork immediately. I told him to execute the adjustment. 3 days later, the coastal road was lined with an absurd display of luxury vehicles. Gleaming black sedans, imported sports cars, and heavy luxury utility vehicles were parked carelessly along the gravel shoulder of the highway, their tires crushing the fragile, protected dune grass. I parked my old heavy work truck a quarter-mile down the road. Its faded paint and rusted steel bumper stood in stark, unapologetic contrast to the display of unearned wealth clogging the street. The night air was cool and tasted of salt, but I could hear the heavy rhythmic thumping of bass from a hired sound system long before I even reached the property line. They were hosting a party. It was not a quiet, intimate dinner to celebrate a new business venture. It was a lavish, sprawling, arrogant event designed to flaunt their newly acquired collateral. They were drinking expensive champagne to celebrate the successful, fraudulent theft of my life savings. I approached the house from the beachside deck, walking up from the shoreline. The custom wraparound porch, which I had painstakingly built from hand-selected weather-treated cedar, was currently swarming with people I had never met. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black ties navigated fluidly through the dense crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with expensive appetizers and crystal champagne flutes. I walked up the wooden stairs. My heavy leather work boots made a solid, resonant sound against the cedar planks. It was a sound entirely different from the soft clicking of designer heels and the quiet shuffle of Italian leather loafers. No one paid any attention to me at first. I was just an older man wearing a canvas jacket and denim jeans, completely invisible to a crowd utterly obsessed with status, wealth, and appearances. I stepped through the massive sliding glass doors and into the main living room. The biometric lock on the front door might have rejected my thumbprint earlier that week, but the rear patio doors were thrown wide open to let in the ocean breeze. The interior of the house had been completely transformed, stripped of the quiet, rustic sanctuary I had originally designed. The space was blindingly bright, illuminated by harsh, rented spotlights. A massive, intricate ice sculpture of a sports car sat melting slowly on the center kitchen island, a grotesque monument to Trevor's vanity. Men in sharply tailored suits were laughing loudly, aggressively, patting each other on the back. Women in shimmering silk dresses nodded along enthusiastically to loud, overlapping conversations about stock portfolios, equity scaling, and leveraging real estate assets. I stood just inside the threshold, holding a standard unmarked manila folder in my right hand. Inside that folder were the legally binding documents my attorney Warren had drafted and filed directly with the State Environmental Commission exactly 48 hours ago. The trap was already set. The steel jaws had already snapped shut. These people simply had not felt the metal bite into their skin yet. It started with a woman standing near the stone fireplace. She noticed me standing perfectly still, completely out of place, staring a hole through the center of the frantic room. Her loud laughter faded into a confused silence. She nudged her husband, spilling a drop of red wine on his sleeve. He turned, his confident smile dropping instantly as he saw my grim face. The silence began to spread outward from where I stood, moving through the dense crowd, like a heavy drop of black ink in a clear glass of water. The loud, boastful conversations faltered and died. The sharp clinking of crystal glasses stopped. Within 30 seconds, the only sound left in the massive vaulted room was the pulsing, ignorant bass of the background music. 100 pairs of wealthy, judging eyes were locked entirely onto me. The crowd parted slightly, creating a clear path to the center of the room. Standing next to the extravagant ice sculpture was my daughter. Natalie was wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown that hugged her figure perfectly. She held a half-empty martini glass, her fingernails painted a sharp crimson. When she finally turned and saw me standing by the glass doors, all the vibrant color completely drained from her face. Her hand began to shake violently, spilling a splash of clear liquor onto the expensive hardwood floor I had polished myself. She did not walk toward me. She did not ask why her father was standing in her home. True to the absolute cowardice of her nature, she took a deliberate, hurried step backward, hiding herself behind the broad shoulders of a tall man in a gray suit. She averted her gaze entirely, staring blankly down at her expensive designer shoes, refusing to acknowledge the man she had betrayed. Trevor, however, did not hide. He separated himself from a group of wealthy private investors near the kitchen and walked slowly toward me. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue velvet dinner jacket, radiating an overwhelming, suffocating aura of unearned arrogance. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, a condescending, victorious smirk playing on his lips. He stopped a few feet away from me, looking me up and down with exaggerated performative pity. He spoke loudly, projecting his voice to make absolutely sure it carried across the dead silent room. He asked me if I was lost. He turned his back to me slightly, offering a theatrical sigh to the crowd, and announced to his wealthy friends that his poor father-in-law had been struggling significantly with his memory and boundaries lately. A few nervous, mocking chuckles rippled through the gathered guests. He turned back to me, his voice dripping with absolute venom masquerading as familial concern. He told me that I was embarrassing myself in front of highly important people. He stated with absolute authority that the construction site was permanently closed, my physical services were no longer required, and I needed to go back to my small apartment before I ruined their monumental celebration. I did not react to his public mockery. I did not raise my voice to defend my mental state to a room full of strangers who fed on drama. I kept my eyes locked directly and intensely onto his. I gripped the manila folder slightly tighter in my hand. I told him, my voice completely steady, deep, and carrying a terrifying clarity, that I was not there to celebrate anything. I told him I was there to deliver a final message regarding the structural integrity of the property he falsely claimed to own. Trevor immediately lost his arrogant smile. The muscles in his jaw tightened visibly. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying desperately to use his height and his expensive cologne to intimidate me. He lowered his voice to a harsh, aggressive whisper meant only for my ears. He told me that I had absolutely zero leverage left to play. He bragged, his breath smelling of expensive scotch, that the private bank had already thoroughly reviewed the title, approved the collateral assignment, and the $2 million wire transfer was scheduled to clear the Federal Reserve the very next morning. He called me a pathetic, washed-up old man who simply did not know when he was beaten. He demanded that I turn around and walk out the glass doors immediately, or he would have me violently removed by force. I simply stood my ground. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I told him I was not leaving this property until the message in my hand was officially delivered. The absolute lack of fear in my eyes infuriated him beyond measure. Trevor spun around, raising his hands dramatically to the silent, watching audience. He played the role of the victimized homeowner perfectly. He announced loudly to the room that he had tried his best to handle this unfortunate family matter with grace and dignity. But I was clearly trespassing and acting in a highly aggressive manner. He pulled his sleek, expensive smartphone from his velvet jacket pocket. He did not ask the hired private security guards at the front gate to quietly escort me out. He wanted a brutal public execution of my dignity. He wanted me dragged out of the very house I built, locked in steel handcuffs, surrounded by flashing red and blue lights, to prove his absolute dominance over me in front of the private loan appraiser standing in the corner. He dialed the emergency services number and put the phone on speaker. The loud, rhythmic dialing tone echoed sharply through the tense, quiet room. When the emergency dispatcher answered the call, Trevor's voice immediately shifted into a panicked, frantic, highly fabricated register. He gave the dispatcher the exact municipal address of the beach house. He claimed there was a hostile, disgruntled former contractor refusing to leave the premises. He lied effortlessly, claiming I was making physical threats and that his wife was currently terrified for her physical safety. He formally requested immediate police assistance to remove a dangerous trespasser from his private estate. He hung up the phone and glared at me, a victorious, ugly sneer plastered across his face. He told me the local police were currently on their way, and that I was going to spend the rest of the night sitting in a freezing concrete holding cell. He expected me to panic. He fully expected me to beg for his forgiveness, to plead with Natalie across the room to call off the police, or to turn and run out the back door into the dark night. I did none of those things. I slowly reached into the breast pocket of my canvas jacket, pulled out my wire-rimmed reading glasses, and calmly put them on my face. I opened the manila folder, silently reviewing the first page of the state environmental decree. I looked back up at Trevor, who was now breathing heavily, surrounded by his terrified wife and his confused, wealthy friends. I told him the police were exactly who I needed to see. I told him the celebration was entirely over and the real adjustment was about to begin. The distant wail of police sirens cut sharply through the heavy rhythmic bass of the party music. The sound grew louder by the second, bouncing off the coastal rocks and echoing across the dark water. Trevor crossed his arms over his expensive velvet dinner jacket, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He leaned against the edge of the marble kitchen island, turning to his wealthy investors to announce that the trash was finally being taken out. He fully expected me to panic. He expected me to pace the floor, beg for his mercy, or try to run out the back doors into the night. Instead, I stood perfectly still. I felt the smooth, cold surface of the manila folder in my hand. Through the large floor-to-ceiling windows, intense red and blue lights began to flash rapidly, painting the cedar walls and the terrified faces of the gathered guests in harsh alternating colors. 2 county police cruisers crunched aggressively onto the gravel driveway, effectively boxing in the luxury sedans. 3 officers stepped out of their vehicles, the heavy thud of their boots vibrating against the wooden porch steps. They entered the living room with their hands resting cautiously on their dark leather duty belts. Someone quickly rushed over and killed the sound system. The music died instantly. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating, broken only by the sharp static crackle of the police radios. Trevor did not waste a single second. He practically sprinted across the polished hardwood floor toward the lead officer, a tall man with graying hair and a severe, uncompromising expression. Trevor immediately launched into his highly fabricated narrative, his voice trembling with artificial, practiced distress. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, claiming I was a disgruntled former contractor who had completely lost his mind. He told the officers that I had violently broken into his private anniversary celebration, aggressively threatened his wife, and stubbornly refused to leave the private premises. He demanded that I be placed in steel handcuffs immediately and formally charged with criminal trespassing and aggravated harassment. Natalie finally stepped out from behind the dense crowd of guests. She clutched a delicate silk handkerchief, nodding along frantically to her husband's desperate lies, while managing to squeeze out a few rehearsed tears. She played the role of the terrified, victimized homeowner perfectly. The lead officer listened patiently to their performance, his eyes scanning the opulent, crowded room before settling entirely on me. He took a slow, measured step in my direction, silently instructing the other 2 officers to flank him. He placed his hand firmly on his radio, asking me in a loud, commanding voice to step away from the guests and place my empty hands where he could clearly see them. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend my character against Trevor's desperate, cowardly lies. I calmly stepped forward, moving away from the frozen crowd, and held my hands out directly in front of me. In my right hand, I extended the manila folder toward the lead officer. I spoke in a quiet, deeply respectful tone, a stark contrast to Trevor's frantic shouting. I told the officer that I was not there to cause any physical harm or disrupt the public peace. I clearly stated that I was the original architect and the sole legal leaseholder of the physical land beneath our feet, and I was simply there to deliver a legally binding state notification to the current occupants. The lead officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting quickly between my calm, unbothered demeanor and Trevor's sweating, flushed face. He reached out and took the folder from my hand. I asked him to carefully look at the very first document, which was a certified, stamped municipal zoning map, and then the second document, which was an expedited legal decree sent directly from the State Environmental Commission. The officer opened the folder. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. I did not address Trevor directly anymore. I spoke clearly and methodically, directly to the officer, ensuring that every single guest, and most importantly, the commercial loan appraiser standing quietly near the stone fireplace, heard every single word of my explanation. I explained that the $550,000 house surrounding us was legally built on a highly protected state wildlife trust. I detailed the strict non-transferable agricultural provision that I had personally signed 2 years ago. That specific provision explicitly forbade any commercialization, subdivision, or corporate leveraging of the coastal property. I stated clearly that by forging a title transfer to themselves and immediately offering the property as collateral for a $2 million commercial loan. The current occupants had fundamentally and irreversibly violated the ironclad state charter. Trevor began to shout, his face turning a deep, unnatural shade of crimson. He screamed that the documents were elaborate fakes and demanded again that the officers arrest me immediately. But the lead officer did not reach for his handcuffs. He ignored Trevor entirely. He continued reading the official state decree, his expression shifting rapidly from cautious suspicion to profound, serious realization. He recognized the official seals. He understood the legal weight of the terminology. I finished my explanation by delivering the final crushing blow. I stated that because the charter had been violated through an act of commercial fraud, the state government had officially and permanently revoked the land lease. I explained that the revocation rendered Trevor's forged real estate title completely worthless. I told the officer that they were currently standing inside an illegal structure. The state had legally demanded that the property be restored to its natural condition, meaning the house was slated for immediate municipal demolition. Trevor lunged forward, trying to snatch the folder out of the officer's hands, screaming that I was an insane old man trying to ruin his life. The two flanking officers instantly stepped in, grabbing Trevor by his velvet shoulders and shoving him firmly back against the kitchen island, warning him to stay exactly where he was. The lead officer closed the manila folder and looked at Trevor with an expression of cold, bureaucratic authority. He informed Trevor that the documents appeared perfectly legitimate and carried the seal of the state commission. He explained that the police were there to handle criminal trespassing, but according to the state decree, I was the only person with the legal authority to be standing on the dirt beneath the house. The officer turned to Trevor and stated that this was a massive civil and federal property dispute, and he had absolutely no authority to arrest the legal leaseholder. The silence in the room transformed from anticipation into sheer, suffocating terror. Natalie dropped her silk handkerchief. The wealthy investors began to slowly back away toward the exits, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the federal fraud investigation. My eyes drifted past Trevor's pale, defeated face and landed directly on the commercial loan appraiser standing by the fireplace. The appraiser had heard everything. He had heard the words forged title state trust and municipal demolition. He was actively typing into his digital tablet, his face completely drained of color, already severing the financial lifeline Trevor had sacrificed everything to secure. The trap had not just closed, it had shattered their foundation entirely. The lead officer closed the manila folder. The sharp snap of the cardboard echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent room. He handed the documents back to me with a brief, almost imperceptible nod of professional respect. He turned his broad shoulders toward Trevor, who was still pinned against the marble kitchen island by the two flanking deputies. The officer instructed his men to release their grip. Trevor stumbled forward slightly, his custom velvet jacket wrinkled, his face drained of all its previous arrogant color. The officer spoke with absolute uncompromising authority. He announced that the local police department would not be executing any arrests on the premises tonight. He stated clearly that the property was officially classified as an active federal dispute zone and an illegal structure under state environmental law. He looked Trevor directly in the eyes and warned him that if he attempted to physically remove me or touch me in any way, he would be instantly arrested and charged with felony assault. The police were no longer Trevor's personal security force. They had become neutral witnesses to his total catastrophic humiliation. The lead officer tipped his hat slightly in my direction, signaled his deputies, and walked out the heavy glass patio doors. The red and blue lights stopped flashing against the cedar walls. The cruisers rolled down the gravel driveway, leaving the house in a suffocating, terrifying quiet. The departure of the police acted like a starter pistol for the gathered guests. The wealthy investors, the venture capitalists, and the society wives had come to drink expensive champagne and celebrate a lucrative business expansion. They had absolutely zero interest in being physically present at an active crime scene involving federal wire fraud and state property violations. A man in a tailored charcoal suit set his crystal flute down on a side table. He did not say a single word to Trevor or Natalie. He simply turned and walked swiftly toward the front door. His silent departure broke the dam. The entire room moved simultaneously. It was a mass, frantic exodus of unearned wealth. The sound of designer heels clicking rapidly across the polished hardwood floor sounded like a panicked stampede. Women grabbed their silk wraps and men avoided eye contact, entirely rushing out to their imported sports cars and luxury sedans. Trevor desperately tried to stop them. He reached out to a silver-haired man who was supposed to be a primary financial backer for the new car dealership, begging him to stay, claiming it was all a massive misunderstanding created by a bitter old man. The investor physically swatted Trevor's hand away. He stated coldly that he did not do business with men who forged real estate titles and lied to the state government. Within 3 agonizing minutes, the lavish party was entirely dead. The massive ice sculpture on the kitchen island continued to melt under the harsh rented spotlights, dripping water onto the pristine marble counter, pooling like heavy tears. Only 5 people remained in the cavernous living room. Myself, Trevor, Natalie, a confused hired bartender wiping down a counter, and the commercial loan appraiser. The appraiser had not moved toward the door with the rest of the guests. He was standing near the stone fireplace, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the bright lights. He was staring intently at the screen of his digital tablet, his finger swiping rapidly across the glass. He finally looked up, his expression completely devoid of any human empathy. He did not look at Trevor as a valued client anymore. He looked at him as a massive, toxic financial liability. The appraiser walked slowly to the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from where Trevor was heavily hyperventilating. The appraiser spoke in a crisp, clinical tone that cut through the silence like a scalpel. He stated that his private lending firm maintained a strict, absolute zero-tolerance policy regarding title discrepancies and collateral misrepresentation. He elaborated that submitting a forged quitclaim deed to secure a commercial loan was not merely a clerical error, it was a deliberate act of bank fraud. He informed Trevor that he had just accessed the county records portal on his secure tablet and confirmed everything I had just told the police. He confirmed that the State Environmental Commission had indeed filed an emergency injunction against the property exactly 48 hours ago. The collateral they had offered was fundamentally non-existent. Trevor raised his trembling hands, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. He pleaded with the appraiser. He begged for a 24-hour extension, promising he could clear up the paperwork with the municipal zoning office, promising he could offer a different business asset to secure the funding. The appraiser simply shook his head. He pulled a sleek black smartphone from his breast pocket. He did not step outside to make the call. He wanted to execute the financial termination right there in the open room, ensuring a clear legal record of his actions. He dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. A woman answered, identifying herself as the night manager of the commercial underwriting department. The appraiser recited a long, complex alphanumeric account number. He then stated clearly and unequivocally that the collateral for the $2 million dealership loan had been flagged for federal title fraud and state charter violations. He formally instructed the underwriting department to immediately and permanently cancel the pending wire transfer. He ordered them to freeze all associated business accounts linked to Trevor's name and forward the entire application file to their internal legal department for a criminal review. The woman on the speaker confirmed the immediate cancellation. The line clicked dead. The sound of that phone call disconnecting was the exact moment Trevor's empire shattered into absolute dust. The $2 million was the lifeblood of his entire operation. He had already signed the massive commercial lease for the car dealership lot. He had already ordered the initial fleet of luxury inventory. He had leveraged his existing credit lines to their absolute maximum limits, banking entirely on that massive wire transfer, clearing the Federal Reserve the very next morning. Without those funds, his checks would bounce by noon. His creditors would immediately call in his outstanding debts. By tomorrow afternoon, he would be forced into involuntary bankruptcy, facing multiple lawsuits from his suppliers. His knees buckled entirely. He grabbed the edge of the marble island to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Natalie finally moved. She rushed to his side, grabbing his arm. Her eyes were wide with a terror she could no longer fake. She looked at the appraiser, then finally, she looked directly at me. Her stunning emerald green evening gown suddenly looked entirely ridiculous. It was a costume worn by a woman who had just lost absolutely everything she valued in the world. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to deploy her weaponized tears, perhaps to beg her father to fix the massive hole in their sinking ship. But she looked at my face and the words died in her throat. She saw the absolute unyielding coldness in my eyes. She finally realized that the safety net she had abused her entire life had been permanently removed. The appraiser did not offer a polite goodbye. He slipped his digital tablet into his heavy leather briefcase, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door, leaving the heavy oak door wide open to the cool night air. I stood in the center of the room for one final moment. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the distant rocks. I looked at the daughter I had raised and the man she had chosen to conspire with. I did not feel a single drop of pity or regret. I felt the clean, cold satisfaction of a failing structure being successfully demolished. I looked at Trevor, whose face was now buried deep in his hands. I told him that he had wanted my house so badly that he was willing to steal my signature to get it. I told him he could keep the house for now, but he should probably start packing his expensive suits into garbage bags. I reminded him that the municipal demolition crews moved incredibly fast once the state issued a formal reclamation order. I turned my back on them. I walked slowly out the open glass doors, stepped off the cedar porch, and walked across the damp grass toward the highway, leaving them entirely alone in the blindingly bright, empty room to wait for their inevitable ruin. 72 hours had passed since I walked out of the glass doors of the coastal property and left my daughter standing in the ruins of her fraudulent celebration. I had returned to my modest two-bedroom apartment on the quiet outskirts of the city. The space was incredibly simple. The floors were covered in inexpensive laminate wood, and the walls were painted a plain, unassuming white. It lacked the soaring vaulted ceilings, the custom cedar trim, and the sweeping ocean views of the beach house I had built. But it held something infinitely more valuable to a man my age. It held absolute, impenetrable peace. It was a fortress that belonged entirely to me, completely free from the toxic entitlement of my daughter and the cowardly arrogance of her husband. I spent those 3 days reading old architectural journals, taking long walks through the neighborhood park, and drinking cheap drip coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. I did not check my phone. I did not monitor my email. I knew a massive financial storm was raging across the city, tearing aggressively through Trevor's delicate empire, but I felt absolutely no paternal obligation to stand out in the rain and shield them from the lightning. It was Thursday morning when my quiet sanctuary was finally breached. I was standing at the small kitchen counter, carefully measuring dark coffee grounds into a paper filter when the aggressive pounding started. It was not a polite, hesitant knock. It was a frantic, violent hammering against the cheap metal of my apartment door. The sharp sound echoed loudly down the narrow, carpeted hallway of the building. The person on the other side was not asking for permission to enter my home. They were demanding immediate salvation. I did not rush. I did not panic. I carefully placed the plastic measuring scoop back into the tin container, wiped a single stray coffee ground from the laminate counter with a damp cloth, and walked slowly toward the entryway. I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the small glass peephole. Standing in the fluorescently lit hallway was Natalie. The physical transformation was profound and absolute. The arrogant, untouchable woman wearing the stunning emerald green evening gown had completely vanished, erased by 72 hours of sheer terror. Her expensive designer clothes had been replaced by a wrinkled gray sweater and stained athletic pants. Her hair, usually perfectly styled by an expensive salon, was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot at the base of her neck. Dark streaks of expensive mascara stained her pale cheeks, running down her face in jagged, ugly lines. She was trembling visibly under the harsh hallway lights, clutching her expensive leather handbag tightly against her chest, like a protective shield. She raised her fist to pound on the metal door again, her knuckles red and raw from the effort. I reached out and turned the brass deadbolt. The heavy metallic click seemed to freeze her in place. I opened the door, slowly stepping squarely into the center of the doorframe. I did not open the door wide enough to invite her inside. I did not offer her a comforting glass of water or a chair to sit and catch her breath. I stood like a solid brick wall, looking down at the woman who had happily traded my dignity and my life savings for a down payment on a luxury car dealership. Natalie did not wait for a greeting. The moment she saw my face, the dam broke entirely. A torrent of frantic, terrified words spilled from her mouth. Her voice was shrill and desperate, completely stripped of the cold, patronizing tone she had used on the phone just a few days prior. She told me that absolutely everything was gone. She explained that the commercial appraiser had not just canceled the $2 million wire transfer. He had immediately notified all the major credit bureaus and Trevor's existing commercial banking partners about the fraudulent collateral application. The financial contagion had spread faster than a wildfire in dry brush. She gasped for air, her chest heaving, explaining the brutal mechanics of their rapid collapse. By Monday afternoon, Trevor's primary business accounts were entirely frozen, pending a massive federal fraud investigation. By Tuesday morning, the suppliers for his new luxury car dealership had panicked. They demanded immediate cash payment for the high-end inventory that had already been delivered to the lot. When Trevor could not produce the funds because his accounts were locked, the suppliers arrived with flatbed trucks and repossessed every single vehicle. She told me that their personal credit cards were declining at the local grocery store. The private contractors who had been hired to build the extravagant pool cabana were threatening to place a mechanic lien on the coastal property, entirely unaware that the property itself was a legal fiction that belonged to the state. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, whispering that they were facing involuntary commercial bankruptcy, multiple civil lawsuits, and absolute personal ruin. I listened to her panicked confession in complete silence. I did not nod in understanding. I did not offer a comforting smile. I simply analyzed her behavior with the cold precision of an engineer inspecting a failed support column. She began to cry louder, dropping her heavy leather handbag onto the hallway carpet. She reached out and grabbed the sleeves of my canvas work shirt, her perfectly manicured fingers digging desperately into my arms. She sank slightly to her knees, looking up at me through a thick curtain of weaponized tears. She sobbed violently, claiming that she was terrified that Trevor was practically catatonic on their living room floor and that they had absolutely nowhere else to turn for help. As I looked down at her tear-stained face, a very specific, painful memory clicked into my mind. She was 20 years old, standing in the cramped, messy dormitory room of her university. I had just driven 4 hours through a blinding snowstorm to confront her. She had stolen my emergency credit card from my wallet during a weekend visit and completely maxed out the $10,000 limit on designer clothes and expensive beach vacations with her friends. When I showed her the massive itemized credit card statement, she had reacted exactly like this. She had dropped to the floor, grabbing my jacket, crying hysterically, claiming she was under immense peer pressure and that she would surely drop out of school from the severe emotional stress if I did not forgive her. I had paid the $10,000 bill the very next morning to save her credit score and protect her future. I had looked at her tears and foolishly seen genuine remorse. I realized now, staring at her in the quiet hallway of my apartment building, that I had been an absolute fool for decades. Her tears were not an expression of sorrow or regret for the pain she caused. Her tears were a highly practiced, deeply manipulative survival mechanism. She was not crying because she felt guilty for forging my name on a legal real estate deed. She was crying because she had finally been caught by the system, and she was terrified of the impending inescapable consequences of her own greed. I gently but firmly detached her fingers from my shirt. I took a deliberate step back into my apartment, forcing her to stand up on her own 2 feet, or fall onto the carpet. The absolute coldness in my eyes must have startled her, because her loud sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by a confused, desperate silence. She finally articulated the true purpose of her visit. She did not come to my home to apologize for the massive theft. She did not come to beg for my forgiveness regarding the public humiliation she allowed her husband to inflict upon me at the party. She cleared her throat, wiping the smeared makeup from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and asked me for money. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the request hung heavily in the quiet hallway. She spoke quickly, her eyes darting nervously back and forth, desperate to sell me a solution. She proposed a new financial plan. She asked me to liquidate the remaining funds in my retirement account. She begged me to personally co-sign a massive bridge loan to unfreeze Trevor's business assets and pay off the angry suppliers. She promised, with absolutely zero leverage or credibility to her name, that they would pay me back every single penny with interest as soon as the car dealership became profitable and the federal investigation was cleared. She actually believed that the fundamental dynamic of our relationship had remained entirely unchanged. She genuinely thought that beneath my quiet anger, I was still the exact same reliable safety net I had always been. She assumed that my biological paternal instinct to protect her from pain and hardship would easily override my desire for basic human dignity. She thought the events at the beach house were just a severe scolding, a temporary display of anger from an old father who would eventually fold under the immense pressure of his daughter's tears. She looked at me with bright, expectant eyes, waiting for the familiar sigh of defeat, waiting for me to reach into my pocket and hand her the keys to her salvation. I looked at the woman standing before me. I saw the greed, the deep entitlement, and the absolute lack of accountability that had thoroughly poisoned her soul. She had come to my door a beggar, expecting the old king to simply open the treasury vault and save her from the wolves. She had absolutely no idea that the treasury was permanently locked, and the king was the one who had personally commanded the wolves to attack. I let the heavy silence stretch out for a long time, allowing her frantic hope to slowly wither and die under my unyielding gaze. I took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the final crushing reality of her situation. I stood in the doorway, letting her frantic proposal hang in the stale air of the quiet hallway. She had just asked me to liquidate my remaining retirement accounts and co-sign a massive commercial bridge loan to save her husband from federal indictment and absolute bankruptcy. She was staring up at me, her chest heaving, waiting for the familiar warmth of my capitulation. I looked closely at her eyes. The initial burst of tears had already stopped. The moisture on her cheeks was rapidly drying under the harsh fluorescent lights of the apartment building. She was no longer crying out of genuine despair. She was holding her breath in eager anticipation, treating me like an automated teller machine that was simply taking too long to process a transaction. She genuinely believed that her dramatic performance had successfully bypassed my logic. I did not move a single muscle. I did not soften my rigid posture. I simply watched her, dissecting her manufactured grief with the clinical detachment of a structural engineer observing a predictable and entirely preventable chemical reaction. I finally broke the heavy silence. My voice was low, perfectly steady, and completely devoid of any parental warmth. I asked her if she remembered our telephone conversation from exactly 4 days ago. I watched a brief flash of confusion cross her face, followed immediately by a dark shadow of genuine panic, as she realized I had not forgotten a single syllable of her betrayal. I reminded her of the exact callous tone she had used when I was standing in the gravel driveway of the house I built, locked out by a biometric scanner that had intentionally erased my fingerprint. I repeated her own words back to her, articulating each syllable with sharp, deliberate precision. I reminded her that she had called my life savings dead equity. I reminded her that she had treated my physical labor and my unconditional love as a useless, outdated asset that was severely complicating their brilliant corporate underwriting process. I pointed out the absolute, breathtaking hypocrisy of her current position. On Monday, she was a ruthless corporate visionary ordering a bothersome old man off her property. On Thursday, she was a terrified child begging that same old man to empty his bank accounts to save her from the devastating consequences of federal bank fraud. Natalie opened her mouth, stammering, trying to form a desperate apology, trying to claim that she had been under immense stress from Trevor and the aggressive private lending bank. I raised my hand, a simple, sharp gesture that instantly silenced her. I told her I had absolutely zero interest in her manufactured excuses. I systematically dismantled her first financial proposal. I told her that co-signing a commercial bridge loan for Trevor was not just a terrible financial investment, it was an act of absolute insanity. I explained the cold, hard reality of her situation using the very business terms she claimed to understand so well. Trevor was currently the primary target of an active federal wire fraud investigation. His existing commercial accounts were entirely frozen by the federal government. His luxury vehicle inventory had been aggressively repossessed by furious suppliers. He possessed absolutely zero liquid collateral. I told her that attaching my clean, unblemished financial record to a man sinking rapidly under the weight of federal indictments would be financial suicide. I told her, looking directly into her terrified eyes, that I would not risk a single penny of my credit to throw a life preserver to a man who had intentionally tried to drown me. She recoiled slightly, the reality of my refusal beginning to crack her delicate facade. She shifted her strategy, immediately abandoning Trevor and focusing entirely on herself. She reached out again, her voice dropping to a frantic, broken whisper, begging me to at least release a portion of my personal retirement funds, just to help her hire a competent criminal defense attorney and keep her own personal bank accounts from going into total default. She pleaded that she was my only daughter, desperately invoking the biological bond she had so casually discarded when she forged my signature on a quitclaim deed. I looked at her hands, the expensive manicured nails trembling in the air. I told her no. The word was short, heavy, and absolute. I explained that my retirement funds were the direct result of 40 years of breathing in concrete dust, working 50-hour weeks, and driving vehicles with rusted floorboards so that she could attend expensive universities and wear designer clothes. I stated clearly that those funds were meant to secure my peace in my final years, not to serve as a legal defense fund for a woman who actively conspired to steal my property. I told her my money was permanently locked away, completely inaccessible to her tears, her panic, or her fraudulent husband. Natalie took a stumbling step backward, her back hitting the painted wall of the hallway. Her breathing became erratic. She began to shake her head frantically, refusing to process the magnitude of the rejection. She kept repeating the word "we." She cried out that we were family, that we needed to stick together, that we could figure a way out of this nightmare if we just pooled our resources and fought the bank together. I cut her off instantly, slicing through her delusions. I told her that the word "we" had permanently died the moment she stood quietly in her lavish living room and allowed Trevor to call the police on me. I reminded her that she had hidden behind his velvet jacket, refusing to look me in the eye, while he publicly humiliated me and attempted to have me dragged away in steel handcuffs. I told her there was no family left to save. There was only an old man who had finally learned his lesson and a corrupt couple about to face the devastating, unyielding machinery of the federal justice system. She had chosen her partner. She had chosen her path of deception. Now she had to walk it entirely alone. The absolute finality of my words crashed down upon her. The manipulative hope completely drained from her face, leaving behind a hollow, devastating despair. She realized that the safety net was not just temporarily withdrawn. It had been systematically cut into pieces and burned to ash. I was an iron wall, cold, solid, and entirely unmovable. I watched her process the terrifying reality that she was going to lose the expensive cars, the designer wardrobe, the country club memberships, and quite possibly her physical freedom. She had played a reckless game of absolute greed, betting everything on the assumption that my unconditional love made me incredibly weak and forgiving. She had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man who raised her. I did not build skyscrapers and heavy load-bearing foundations by being weak or easily manipulated. I built them by understanding exactly how much pressure a structure could take before it needed to be ruthlessly demolished. Natalie slumped against the hallway wall, completely broken. She covered her face with her trembling hands. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke again, entirely defeated. She asked me what they were supposed to do now. She sobbed that the bank was going to foreclose on everything, that they would be utterly homeless, forced to live in the unfinished shell of the beach house while the lawyers picked apart their remaining assets. She genuinely believed that living in the $550,000 house without electricity or luxury furniture was the absolute worst-case scenario. She thought the financial ruin and the frozen bank accounts were the end of the punishment. She had absolutely no idea that the financial ruin was merely the opening act. I looked at her pathetic, trembling form. I did not feel a single ounce of satisfaction or joy. I only felt the cold, mechanical necessity of finishing the job I had started. I reached into the back pocket of my canvas trousers. She thought she still had a roof over her head. It was time to show her exactly how deep the demolition truly went. She was huddled on the cheap hallway carpet, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She had just vocalized her ultimate nightmare, the absolute bottom of her downward spiral. She believed that losing her luxury vehicles, her country club memberships, and her husband's fraudulent business accounts was the full extent of the punishment. She genuinely thought that the absolute worst-case scenario was retreating to the $550,000 coastal property and living off the grid. She imagined herself sitting inside the massive vaulted living room, surrounded by the custom cedar walls I had built, eating cheap canned food, while hiding from federal investigators and angry creditors. She still viewed that house as her ultimate safety net, a permanent physical fortress that no bank could ever fully take away because I had paid for the construction in cash. She was clinging to the timber and the stone with the desperate grip of a drowning sailor holding onto a piece of driftwood. It was time to pull the driftwood completely under the water. I did not offer a hand to help her up from the floor. Instead, I reached into the back pocket of my canvas trousers. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe away her ruined makeup. I pulled out a single thick piece of heavy parchment paper. It had been folded precisely into thirds. Unlike the thick manila folder I had carried into her lavish party 3 nights ago, this document was stark simple and terrifyingly final. It bore the heavy raised embossed seal of the State Environmental Commission at the very top. I unfolded the heavy paper slowly. The crisp, sharp sound of the creasing parchment echoed loudly in the narrow, silent hallway, cutting right through the lingering sound of her pathetic sobbing. I looked down at her, my face a mask of absolute unyielding calm. I told her that she was operating under a massive fundamental misunderstanding of how the law worked when dealing with protected wildlife conservancies. I stepped forward and held the document out, forcing her to look at it. She hesitated, her trembling fingers hovering in the air, before she finally reached up and took it from my hand. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, swollen from the frantic, manipulative tears she had shed, but they widened in sheer terror as they scanned the bold, capitalized letters printed across the top of the page. It was a state-mandated order of structural reclamation. She read the words, but her panicked mind could not fully process the dense legal terminology. She looked up at me, her lips trembling, her voice barely a hollow whisper. She asked me what a reclamation order meant, desperately hoping it was just another fine they could somehow delay or a bureaucratic hurdle they could eventually negotiate. I told her there was no negotiation. I explained that when Trevor brazenly forged the title and offered the property to a commercial bank, he did not just void the lease. He triggered an automatic, non-negotiable environmental penalty. The state did not want the house. The state did not want to sell the house to recoup the fraudulent debt. The state demanded that the illegal structure be entirely erased from existence. I watched her face as I slowly and methodically translated the legal text into a brutal, inescapable reality. I told her that the decree mandated the total demolition of the entire property. The custom wraparound cedar deck she loved to host parties on was going to be torn apart by heavy machinery. The imported floor-to-ceiling storm windows were going to be shattered and hauled away in dump trucks. The reinforced steel pilings I had spent weeks driving deep into the coastal bedrock were going to be violently extracted from the earth. I told her that by the end of the month, the entire $550,000 house, the symbol of their greed and the monument to my foolish, unconditional love, was going to be returned to flat, empty sand. I explained that she was not going to live in that house while they fought the bankruptcy courts. She was not going to hide inside my hard work. I told her the structure was legally condemned. The power grid had already been severed by the municipality, and the property was currently surrounded by a chain-link fence erected by the county sheriff. Natalie dropped the thick parchment paper onto the hallway carpet as if it had physically burned her fingers. She pressed her back hard against the wall, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps. She began to shake her head frantically, refusing to accept the magnitude of the destruction. She cried out that it was completely impossible. She stammered that demolishing a structure of that massive size would cost tens of thousands of dollars in municipal permits, heavy equipment rentals, and specialized labor. She looked up at me with a sudden, desperate flash of hope, claiming that the state moved incredibly slowly, that they would never allocate the taxpayer budget to tear down a brand new house that quickly. She told me they had months, maybe even years, before anyone actually showed up with a bulldozer. I looked at her, letting a long, heavy silence fill the space between us. I finally allowed a small, cold, utterly detached smile to touch the corners of my mouth. I told her the state did not have to spend a single penny of taxpayer money to execute the demolition. I told her they already had a fully funded, highly qualified contractor ready to tear it down immediately. I watched the exact moment the final realization hit her. I watched her eyes widen as she finally understood the true depth of my silent adjustment. I explained that because I was the original architect of record, the master builder who engineered the foundation, and the legal leaseholder of the protected dirt, I was legally obligated to execute the environmental restoration. I told her that my attorney had petitioned the state board, and they had officially awarded me the municipal demolition contract. I was not just stepping aside to let her fall. I was the one driving the machinery that would crush her fraudulent empire into the dirt. I told her that my heavy equipment operators were already scheduled. I advised her to go back to the condemned property, climb over the chain-link fence, and pack whatever expensive designer clothes she could fit into a garbage bag. I told her the bulldozers were arriving first thing on Monday morning, and I was going to be the one giving the order to drop the heavy steel blade. She tried to speak. She opened her mouth, reaching out a trembling hand toward me, but absolutely no words came out. The absolute finality of my actions had completely shattered her reality. The manipulative daughter who had relied on my endless forgiveness had finally encountered a boundary made of solid steel. She realized, kneeling on the cheap carpet of my apartment building, that I had not just taken back my dignity. I had systematically and legally engineered their total annihilation. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no sadness for the little girl she used to be. There was only the profound, quiet peace of a man who had successfully removed a toxic parasite from his life. I stepped backward into the entryway of my apartment. I looked down at her one last time, observing an unfamiliar stranger crying in the hallway. I reached out, grabbed the solid brass handle of my front door, and pulled it shut. The heavy metal locked with a loud, definitive click, leaving her entirely alone in the cold, fluorescent light to face the absolute ruin she had built with her own two hands. Monday morning arrived with a thick coastal fog that rolled off the cold ocean and swallowed the entire shoreline. I parked my heavy work truck on the gravel shoulder of the highway at exactly 6 in the morning. This was the precise spot where Trevor's wealthy investors had carelessly abandoned their imported luxury vehicles just a few nights before. Today, there were no gleaming black sedans or sports cars clogging the road. There was only a formidable line of massive industrial yellow heavy machinery. Two massive excavators with heavy steel treads and a colossal bulldozer sat idling in the damp morning air. The low guttural roar of their diesel engines vibrated powerfully through the soles of my heavy leather work boots and rattled the windows of my truck. The smell of raw diesel exhaust mixed heavily with the salty ocean breeze, creating a sharp, metallic, and unforgiving scent that signaled absolute, undeniable destruction. The operators were men I had worked alongside for over 20 years in the commercial construction business. They were men of few words who respected the hierarchy of the trade. They did not ask me any questions about family dynamics or legal disputes. They simply drank their black coffee from insulated metal thermoses, keeping the massive engines warm and waiting patiently for my physical signal to begin the teardown. I walked slowly toward the property line, letting the heavy fog mist against my face. The temporary chain-link fence erected by the county sheriff over the weekend stood as a stark metallic perimeter around the $550,000 structure. The house looked entirely different in the flat gray morning light. Stripped of the rented party spotlights, the loud music, and the false celebration of fraudulent wealth. It was nothing more than a lifeless, condemned shell waiting to be crushed. The electrical power had been completely severed by the municipality 48 hours ago. The massive floor-to-ceiling storm windows, which I had carefully installed to maximize the beautiful ocean view, were now dark, cold, and entirely blind. I reached out and unlatched the heavy padlock on the temporary gate, stepping onto the damp grass of the front lawn. I remembered the weeks I spent meticulously seeding and watering this very grass, wanting a perfect green carpet for my daughter to walk on. Today, I was going to tear it all up. I raised my right hand and signaled the lead operator sitting high in the cab of the bulldozer. The massive machine lurched forward with a terrifying surge of mechanical power. Its thick steel tracks tore deep, ugly brown gashes into the pristine green lawn, ripping the soil apart with effortless brutality. The bulldozer moved with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum, closing the distance between the paved highway and the coastal foundation I had poured with my own hands. The deafening noise of the approaching machinery, a grinding symphony of metal and diesel, finally breached the thick cedar walls of the dead house. The heavy oak front door was violently thrown open, crashing hard against the exterior siding. Trevor stumbled out onto the wooden porch. The physical and psychological deterioration of the man was absolutely staggering to witness. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable corporate visionary who had worn a midnight blue velvet jacket and sipped expensive champagne. He looked exactly like a man who had not slept a single minute in 4 consecutive days. He was wearing the exact same wrinkled white dress shirt from the night of the party, now heavily stained with dark patches of sweat and dirt. His hair, usually styled with expensive salon products, was a frantic, greasy mess plastered to his forehead. His face was pale, his cheekbones jutting out sharply, and his eyes were wild and bloodshot, darting erratically between the massive yellow bulldozer tearing up the yard and me standing calmly by the fence line. He had spent the entire weekend trapped inside the freezing, unpowered house with Natalie, listening to the howling ocean winds and waiting in absolute terror for the inevitable consequences of his bank fraud. The brutal reality of the bulldozer advancing toward his front door finally broke whatever fragile remnants of his mind were left. He let out a raw, guttural scream, an animalistic sound of pure panic that was entirely swallowed by the overwhelming roar of the diesel engine. Trevor scrambled recklessly down the wooden porch stairs, tripping over his own feet and scraping his hands against the rough cedar planks. He did not run away from the machine. He sprinted directly across the ruined grass into the direct path of the 30-ton bulldozer. He threw his arms out wide, planting his expensive, scuffed leather loafers deep into the damp, torn soil, positioning his fragile human body as a physical barricade directly in front of the massive, rusted steel blade. The operator, a seasoned professional who had safely demolished hundreds of commercial buildings in his career, instantly recognized the danger and pulled back hard on the hydraulic levers. The bulldozer ground to a sudden violent halt just 10 feet away from Trevor. The heavy machine rocked forward slightly on its tracks, before settling the massive engine continuing to idle with a deep, menacing growl that shook the earth. Trevor began to wave his arms frantically through the thick fog, his face completely distorted by sheer desperation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his mouth moving rapidly, screaming at the top of his lungs over the mechanical roar. He was shouting a frantic stream of empty, delusional legal threats. He screamed that he had personally contacted a federal judge at dawn and filed an emergency injunction to halt the demolition. He shouted that his high-powered corporate lawyers were currently speeding down the coastal highway with a signed court order to arrest the machine operators and throw me in a federal prison. He yelled that he still legally held the property equity that the commercial bank was going to reconsider his $2 million loan application, and that I was committing a massive, unforgivable federal crime by attempting to destroy his private residential property. He used every corporate buzzword he could drag from his shattered memory, weaponizing terms like collateral underwriting and asset forfeiture, as if the sheer volume of his vocabulary could magically stop a 30-ton piece of heavy yellow iron. But absolutely none of it was true. There were no federal judges signing emergency injunctions for a man actively wanted for forging real estate deeds. There were no high-powered lawyers rushing to save a toxic client whose business accounts had been entirely seized and frozen by the federal government. He was shouting blindly into the morning fog, clinging desperately to a fabricated alternate reality, because the actual truth of his absolute ruin was entirely unbearable for his massive ego to process. I walked slowly across the deep tread marks in the ruined grass, stopping just a few feet away from the idling machine and the frantic screaming man. I did not yell back at him. I did not engage with his frantic legal fantasy or try to correct his delusional statements. I simply looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. I looked at the pathetic, broken thief who had genuinely thought he was smart enough to steal my legacy and outwit a man who built skyscrapers. He continued to scream, his voice growing hoarse and desperate. He abruptly shifted his strategy from aggressive legal threats to pathetic begging. He demanded that I call off the crew immediately, promising that he would sign the forged deed back over to me that very morning. He promised he would immediately leave the state, divorce my daughter, and never contact our family again if I just stopped the machines. He was finally offering his unconditional surrender, completely unaware that I had never been interested in a negotiation. The war he started had ended days ago in my attorney's office. This was simply the physical cleanup phase, and his presence on the dirt was merely a temporary delay. I stood silently in the fog, letting his frantic promises wash over me without making a single dent in my resolve. He begged me to think of Natalie, claiming she was inside the dark house, shivering and terrified, unable to comprehend that her own father was about to tear down her home. He tried to use her as a human shield, hoping my biological instinct to protect my child would suddenly override the cold logic of the state mandate I held in my pocket. He did not realize that my daughter had already killed that protective instinct when she called my life savings dead equity. The heavy machinery continued to idle, puffing thick black smoke into the gray sky. The lead operator leaned out of the high cab window, looking down at me, waiting for the command to either cut the engine or call the authorities to remove the human obstacle. The standoff was a pathetic display of a man refusing to accept the laws of physics and consequence. Trevor actually believed that his words, which had carried so much weight at cocktail parties and boardroom meetings, could somehow hold back a steel blade driven by hydraulic power. He was about to learn that when the foundation is rotten, no amount of talking can stop the walls from coming down. Trevor was still screaming himself hoarse into the dense morning fog when the heavy crunch of tires on gravel violently interrupted his frantic legal fantasy. Two large, unmarked black utility vehicles pulled off the coastal highway and parked aggressively behind my old work truck, blocking any possible exit. The heavy doors opened simultaneously. Warren stepped out of the lead vehicle, He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit holding a slim black leather briefcase looking entirely out of place on a muddy construction site, but projecting an aura of absolute undeniable legal authority. Behind him, 3 men stepped out of the large vehicles. They were not local county police officers responding to a simple noise complaint. They were federal marshals wearing dark tactical vests over their shirts with thick steel badges clipped prominently to their belts. They moved with a silent, coordinated precision that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the damp morning air. Trevor stopped shouting immediately. His mouth hung open in silent terror. The delusional alternate reality he had desperately constructed over the last 10 minutes completely evaporated the very moment he saw the heavy federal badges shining in the gray light. He took a slow, stumbling step backward, away from the idling bulldozer and away from the approaching marshals. His expensive leather loafers sank deeper into the ruined, muddy grass. He looked at Warren, and then he looked directly at me, his eyes wide with the sudden crushing realization that I had never been bluffing. The silent adjustment was over, and the executioners had just arrived to collect the final toll. Warren walked past me without saying a single word and stopped just a few feet away from Trevor. He opened his black leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue cover. He did not raise his voice or gloat. He spoke with the cold, mechanical cadence of a man delivering a terminal medical diagnosis. He addressed Trevor by his full legal name and informed him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially reviewed the commercial loan application along with the forged quitclaim deed. Warren stated clearly that a federal grand jury had convened over the weekend and successfully handed down a sealed criminal indictment. Trevor began to shake violently. He raised his hands with his palms facing outward as if he could physically push the spoken words away. He stammered frantically, trying to say it was all a simple misunderstanding, a minor clerical error made by the private bank. The lead federal marshal stepped forward instantly, cutting off his pathetic, cowardly excuses. The marshal reached to his dark leather duty belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He instructed Trevor in a loud, commanding voice to turn around and place his hands flat behind his back. Trevor panicked entirely. He tried to spin around and run toward the open front door of the coastal house, but his muddy designer shoes slipped heavily on the wet grass. 2 marshals were on him in a fraction of a second. They grabbed his arms, twisting them firmly and professionally behind his back, forcing him to bow forward. The sharp metallic clicking of the handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed clearly over the rumbling diesel engine of the nearby bulldozer. The sound was incredibly final. The lead marshal began to loudly recite the federal charges as they marched Trevor aggressively across the ruined lawn. Wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud a federally insured financial institution. Every single word spoken carried the massive weight of a mandatory minimum prison sentence. Suddenly, Natalie burst through the open front door of the house. She had heard the loud commotion and stumbled out onto the wooden porch, wearing the same wrinkled gray sweater from the hallway of my apartment. She froze completely at the top of the stairs, watching in absolute horror as her husband was dragged through the wet mud in steel chains. She screamed his name running down the wooden steps, but a third marshal stepped firmly into her path, holding up a rigid hand to stop her advance. She collapsed onto her knees in the wet grass, weeping hysterically, begging the federal officers to let him go, claiming he was a good man who simply made a foolish mistake. The marshals ignored her entirely. Trevor was shoved aggressively into the back seat of the black utility vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut, trapping him inside a dark steel cage of his own making. I stood perfectly still, watching the entire scene unfold before me. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy or triumph. I only felt the clean, satisfying click of a complex mathematical equation finally balancing out to zero. Natalie remained kneeling in the cold mud, sobbing uncontrollably, with her hands covering her pale face. She had happily traded my dignity and my life savings for a shortcut to wealth, and now she was watching her entire future being driven away in a federal convoy. The marshals returned to their vehicles without looking back. The heavy engines started, and the black truck slowly pulled out of the driveway, merging onto the foggy coastal highway, disappearing into the mist. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and expectant. The lead operator, sitting high in the glass cab of the massive yellow bulldozer, leaned forward and looked down at me. He had patiently waited for the federal authorities to clear the designated municipal demolition zone. Now the physical path was entirely clear. There were no more legal delays. There were no more frantic, empty negotiations. I looked at the $550,000 structure sitting quietly under the gray sky. I looked at the custom cedar siding, the imported storm windows, and the sweeping architectural lines. I remembered the sweat, the deep physical exhaustion, and the pure, unconditional love that had built every single inch of that house. Then I looked down at my daughter weeping in the mud, grieving loudly for a federal criminal. I raised my right hand, looked directly into the eyes of the machine operator, and gave him a single definitive nod. The operator pulled back hard on the heavy hydraulic levers. The bulldozer roared to life, its massive diesel engine screaming loudly as it surged forward with terrifying mechanical violence. The 30-ton machine hit the front porch first. The thick wooden steps where Natalie had just been standing shattered instantly into thousands of jagged flying splinters. The massive rusted steel blade pushed forward effortlessly, crushing the custom cedar decking I had spent 3 weeks carefully measuring and cutting. The sound of the snapping wood was entirely deafening, sounding like a volley of continuous heavy gunfire echoing across the empty sandy beach. The bulldozer did not slow down. It drove its massive steel blade directly into the main load-bearing wall of the expansive living room. The violent impact shook the soft earth beneath my heavy boots. The entire structure groaned a deep, agonizing sound of total architectural failure. The expensive floor-to-ceiling storm windows buckled instantly under the immense pressure and exploded inward, raining thousands of shimmering shards of tempered glass across the polished hardwood floors. The elegant vaulted ceiling where they had hung their rented party lights cracked violently down the center and began to cave in. The operator raised the hydraulic blade, lifting the entire front facade of the house clean off its foundation. The solid oak front door, the very door with the biometric lock that had denied me entry, was ripped entirely from its metal hinges and crushed completely under the heavy steel treads of the machine. The machine reversed gears, backing up over the ruined porch, tearing deep, ugly gouges into the earth, before surging forward again to deliver another devastating structural blow. I watched the master bedroom collapse downward. I watched the expensive drywall crumble into a thick cloud of white, choking dust that mixed heavily with the dense morning fog. I watched the intricate wooden roof trusses snap like dry, brittle twigs, sending imported dark shingles sliding down into the growing wreckage. Every single blow from the heavy machinery erased a piece of their massive entitlement. Every crushed oak beam was a direct consequence of their unyielding arrogance. The two massive excavators joined the assault, moving in aggressively from the sides of the property. Their long mechanical arms reached out with heavy iron claws, tearing deeply into the roof and ripping away massive sections of the second-floor framing. They ripped the house apart with the brutal, terrifying efficiency of apex predators tearing into a fresh carcass. They reached into the center of the house and crushed the imported marble kitchen island where the ice sculpture had melted days before. The internal plumbing pipes burst apart, spraying arcs of white water into the dusty air. Electrical wires snapped and sparked brightly before dying out. The sheer scale of the destruction was entirely mesmerizing to witness. $550,000 of my life savings. Decades of my hard physical labor and all the fraudulent dreams of a luxury car dealership were being violently reduced to a massive pile of worthless debris in a matter of minutes. Natalie was screaming loudly, but her voice was completely drowned out by the mechanical roar and the deafening sound of breaking timber. She scrambled backward frantically away from the falling debris, crawling through the thick mud until she reached the chain-link perimeter fence. She pressed her back against the cold metal mesh, staring in absolute paralyzed terror as the walls of her permanent fortress came crashing down into the dirt. She was watching her inheritance, her final safety net, and her unearned wealth being ground entirely into dust by the very man who had given it to her. I stood my ground near the edge of the property line, letting the thick, white drywall dust coat the shoulders of my canvas jacket. I breathed in the sharp smell of shattered cedar and heavy diesel exhaust. The destruction was visceral, absolute, and entirely beautiful. The steel blades showed absolutely no mercy to the expensive imported materials. They did not care about the custom finishes or the elegant modern design. They only followed the unforgiving laws of physics and the direct command of the operator. The house that had been stolen with a forged pen was being taken back with a heavy bulldozer. I watched without blinking until the main structural supports finally gave way and the entire roof collapsed downward, flattening the living room into a compressed mountain of sharp splinters, broken glass, and crushed drywall. The physical demolition was complete, and the foundation was completely clear. The heavy machinery finally cut their massive diesel engines. The sudden absence of the deafening mechanical roar left a strange ringing sensation in the damp morning air. The thick white drywall dust began to settle slowly over the ruined earth, mixing with the rolling gray coastal fog. Where a $550,000 custom estate had stood just an hour ago, there was now absolutely nothing but a flattened expanse of crushed debris and deeply churned sand. The heavy equipment operators had been incredibly thorough in their execution. They used the massive steel buckets of the excavators to scoop up the shattered cedar beams, the bent metal framing the broken glass, and the pulverized drywall, loading it all seamlessly into a fleet of waiting municipal dump trucks. The foundation itself was aggressively cracked and ripped from the bedrock, leaving no trace that a permanent structure had ever existed on that specific parcel of protected land. The ocean breeze blew unobstructed across the empty lot. I could hear the rhythmic crashing of the saltwater waves against the distant rocks. It was a natural, timeless sound that had been temporarily blocked by their arrogant monument to greed. The land had been entirely reclaimed by the state. The fraudulent collateral Trevor had used to secure his $2 million empire had been literally wiped from the face of the earth. I turned my attention away from the empty sand and looked toward the temporary chain-link fence. Natalie was still sitting in the cold mud. She was no longer screaming. The frantic, hysterical energy that had driven her to my apartment door had completely burned out. She was entirely silent, staring blankly at the vacant space where her lavish living room used to be. The absolute totality of her ruin had finally paralyzed her physical body and her mind. In less than a single week, she had gone from a wealthy, untouchable socialite hosting extravagant anniversary parties to a broken woman sitting in the dirt with absolutely nothing to her name. Her husband was currently sitting in the back of a federal vehicle on his way to a holding cell, facing years in a maximum security penitentiary. Her business accounts and personal credit cards were frozen tight by federal investigators. Her luxury cars had been repossessed by furious creditors. Her expensive designer wardrobe had been crushed under 30 tons of heavy yellow iron. She had placed all of her faith in a foundation of lies, manipulation, and entitlement. Now she was experiencing the terrifying endless freefall of having absolutely no safety net left to catch her. She slowly lifted her heavy head and looked directly at me. There was no anger left in her swollen, bloodshot eyes. There was no manipulative plea for salvation. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. She did not reach out her trembling hand. She did not ask me for help. She finally understood that the man standing across the property line was no longer her forgiving father. He was just the architect who had successfully designed and executed the total demolition of her toxic life. I did not offer her a parting word. I did not nod or give her a look of paternal pity. I simply turned my back on the empty lot and began walking down the gravel shoulder of the highway toward my heavy work truck. The thick, wet mud caked on the bottom of my leather boots felt like a physical representation of the massive mess I was finally walking away from. I reached the truck, unlocked the heavy metal door, and climbed into the driver's seat. The cabin was quiet and smelled faintly of old coffee and tough canvas. I reached into the front pocket of my jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and opened the contact list, scrolling down until I found the name of my only daughter. I stared at the bright digital letters for a long, silent moment. I thought about the little girl who used to forge my signature on her middle school report cards. I thought about the young woman who had crashed my work truck and lied to my face without blinking. I thought about the adult who had stood behind a thin living room curtain and allowed her arrogant husband to lock me out of my own hard work. I pressed the delete button. A small digital prompt appeared on the screen asking me if I was absolutely sure I wanted to permanently remove the contact and all associated communication history. I pressed confirm without a single hesitation. Her name disappeared from the screen entirely, leaving a clean, empty white space. I placed the phone back into my pocket. The biological tie had been completely severed. I turned the key in the ignition. The old diesel engine rumbled to life, a comforting, reliable sound that I had trusted for years. I put the truck in gear and drove away from the foggy coastline. I did not look in the rearview mirror a single time. I drove back into the heart of the city, leaving the cold ocean air and the ruined property far behind me. I pulled into the paved parking lot of a small, unassuming diner located just a few blocks away from Warren's corporate law firm. It was a place I had frequented for over 20 years. It was a simple, honest establishment, with worn vinyl booths, faded checkered floors, and waitresses who knew my first name and exactly how I took my morning coffee. It was the exact opposite of the lavish, exclusive, and entirely fake world Trevor and Natalie had desperately tried to buy their way into. I walked through the glass door, hearing the familiar friendly chime of the entry bell. The air inside was warm and smelled heavily of fried bacon, roasted coffee beans, and toasted bread. Warren was already sitting in our usual booth near the back window overlooking the busy street. He had taken off his sharp charcoal suit jacket and loosened his expensive silk tie, looking much more relaxed than he had at the chaotic construction site just an hour prior. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him, resting my hands on the clean table. He did not ask me how I was feeling. He did not ask if I regretted my severe actions or if I felt sorry for my daughter. He knew me better than that. He simply raised his thick ceramic coffee mug in a quiet, respectful toast to a difficult job successfully completed. A waitress walked over and set down 2 heavy plates of steak and eggs, pouring me a fresh, steaming cup of black coffee without me having to say a word. I picked up my heavy silver fork and knife. The slate was completely clean. The toxic heavy weight I had carried on my shoulders for decades was finally gone. I had lost a beautiful house and a biological daughter, but I had successfully reclaimed my absolute dignity and my peace of mind. I took a long sip of the hot, dark coffee and looked out the window at the passing city traffic, feeling entirely and deeply satisfied. I learned that unconditional love must always be paired with unyielding boundaries. When you continuously sacrifice your own dignity to shield your children from the consequences of their actions, you do not teach them gratitude. You only teach them how to expertly exploit your kindness. Real family is never defined by shared biology or the relentless expectation of financial rescue. It is defined by mutual respect, absolute accountability, and genuine loyalty. I walked away from my own daughter to save myself, realizing that sometimes the most profound act of survival is allowing a toxic structure to collapse so you can finally find peace in the ruins. If you have ever had to build an iron wall to protect your peace from entitled family members, hit the like button and share your own story of survival in the comments below.